Annette couldn't sleep at night because of the strange and unusual events that started a few days after she moved into her new place. It was an old house in a quiet and peaceful neighborhood that Annette and her husband had bought to renovate and sell. However, due to the emotional turmoil of her divorce and her need for solitude, she left the house untouched and temporarily stayed there. Everything started on the third night when the sound of a girl crying led Annie to the storage room at the end of the narrow hallway where her room was. The storage room was dark, filled with old and unused items on shelves lined up parallel to each other. The only light in the storage room came from a small window with a broken pane that viewed a small part of the yard. The crying came from behind the last shelf. The storage room had no light, so Annette had to use her phone's flashlight. As soon as she reached the last shelf, the crying stopped. The first thing she noticed was a bottle of acid on the floor, with steam rising from the spilled acid. Soon, another sound caught Annette's attention, this time a wheezing noise coming from deep within someone's throat. When Annette directed her flashlight towards the sound, the hairs on her body stood on end. The face of a girl whose lower jaw and throat had been melted away by acid was the last thing Annette saw before waking up from her nightmare. This was Annette's first nightmare, but it wasn't just the nightmares keeping her awake. A few nights later, Annette noticed noises coming from the storage room. Sounds like someone banging a fist on the wall or scratching at the door. Noises she heard while awake, not in a dream. The house was so old that its strange nighttime noises could be easily explained away. But it didn't take long for Annette to realize the source of the sounds wasn't the house itself, but its dark past. On the 20th night of Annette's stay, she found an old diary among the clutter in one of the rooms. The diary belonged to a teenage girl named Alice, who had lived in the house in 2005, and it began with an unusual entry. Day 3, nightmares. Day 7, noises. Day 15, hallucinations. Reading a few pages of Alice's diary was enough for Annette to realize that the nightmares and sounds she had experienced over the past 3 weeks were a repetition of events Alice had gone through 20 years earlier. Events so disturbing that Alice had fled the house to stay with friends. Yet, the horrors followed her, prompting Alice to uncover their cause. Her search ultimately revealed the house's dark secret, a secret dating back 40 years to a time when a girl named Jacqueline lived there with her father, stepmother, and half-brother. Jacqueline was born with a deformed body and mind. Her mother abandoned her and her father a few years after her birth, and she was raised by her stepmother Elizabeth. Jacqueline was 18, but due to her disabilities, she couldn't live without help. She never left the house and had no friends. Jacqueline's troubles worsened after her father's death. He had left behind a great fortune, which Elizabeth and her son could only inherit if they took care of Jacqueline. Elizabeth only upheld this condition for a week. A few days after Jacqueline's father died, Elizabeth locked Jacqueline in the storage room, treating her like an animal because she thought her a disgrace for the family. The punishments and humiliations continued until Jacqueline decided to end her nightmare life. They found her body after she drank the acid stored in the room, which had melted half her face and throat. Annette now understood that the terrifying girl from her nightmares was Jacqueline. However, she still didn't understand one thing. The diary entries were based on the stepmother Elizabeth's confession, made shortly after Jacqueline's death. Alice had discovered the truth after questioning old neighbors and checking police reports. But why did Elizabeth confess, especially when Jacqueline's death was deemed an accident, and she inherited all the wealth? The answer to Anne's question lay in the tragic events that befell Elizabeth and her son after Jacqueline's death. Madness was the only word that could explain Elizabeth's nonsensical and seemingly foolish claims about Jacqueline's return, which she repeated just days before her own death. No one knew what happened to Elizabeth and her son on January 17, 1984, but their bodies were found around the house, dressed in home clothes and barefoot as if they had been fleeing from something. Both were determined to have died of heart attacks, exactly 21 days after Jacqueline's burial. Anne stared at the number 21, a number that Alice had repeatedly mentioned and circled in her diary. Anne couldn't believe what Alice had discovered. Jacqueline had been locked in the storage room for 21 days, and Elizabeth and her son died exactly 21 days after Jacqueline's death, seemingly having experienced the same terror that Annette and Alice had gone through in that house. But what terrified Annette even more was the last sentence in the diary. Day 21, I see her, she's here. This was the last entry in Alice's diary. Annette didn't know what had happened to Alice, though she subconsciously connected the 21st day to Alice's unfinished entries. She didn't want to accept it. She quickly Googled Alice's name, and within moments, terror and astonishment overcame her face. Alice had died of a heart attack on that very day. Annette's frightened eyes shifted to the bedside clock. It was past midnight. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, as she now entered her own 21st day in that house. As she stared fearfully at the clock's hands, a sound caught her attention. The sound of the storage room door opening. When she reached the hallway, the storage room door was half open. Similar incidents had happened on previous nights. The door lock was broken, and the wind blowing through the broken window in the storage room would push the door open. But something was different that night. Since a few nights before, Annette had placed a chair to block the door, but now the chair was moved aside, and the wind was slamming the door against it. She shouldn't stay in the house any longer. She quickly returned to her room, grabbed her phone and car keys, and prepared to leave. But just as she was about to exit, she froze in place. The reason was an old, tattered dress lying on the floor in front of the room door. A dress that didn't belong to Annette, but one she had seen before, in her nightmares, worn by Jacqueline. She stared at the dress in shock and fear. She tried to ignore it and leave the room, but then the dress moved. She thought she was imagining things, but soon one of the sleeves moved slightly, and a wounded, decayed hand emerged, clawing at the ground and dragging itself across the floor. Annette's breath caught in her chest. She could now clearly see the rest of Jacqueline's body emerging from the dress and crawling towards her. Annette backed away in terror, but soon tripped over the vanity chair and fell to the floor. Crying in fear, she dragged herself to the back of the bed, out of sight of Jacqueline. A heavy silence fell. It seemed everything she had seen was just a hallucination, but soon something under the bed caught her eye. Her body trembled. She stared fearfully under the bed. Jacqueline's melted and burnt face, staring back at Annette from beneath the bed, was the last thing she saw before her death.